I don't think that anymore because the things that have changed me the most never arrived with noise. They arrived quietly, so quietly that I mistook them for ordinary moments. A passing conversation, a silence that lasted a little longer than expected, a look that carried more understanding than words ever could. None of it felt significant at the time. None of it seemed worthy of remembering. And yet, somehow, those are the moments my mind keeps returning to, not because they were dramatic, because they were precise. There's a difference. Drama demands attention. Prevention doesn't. Prevention simply places itself exactly where it belongs and waits until you're ready to recognize it. I think that's what happened with you. Not all at once, not even in a way I could explain while it was happening. You didn't enter my life like someone trying to leave an impression. You weren't performing. You weren't trying to become unforgettable. If anything, you existed with a kind of quiet certainty that almost disappeared into the background. Most people mistake volume for presence. They think being noticed means being important. But presence has never worked that way. Real presence isn't loud enough to interrupt your thoughts. It's quiet enough to become part of them. That's the difference. I didn't realize I was noticing you. I realized I had already started including you in the way I understood things. And that realization didn't feel exciting. It felt impossible, because I've always protected the architecture of my mind. People often assume that privacy is about hiding secrets. It isn't. Secrets are simple. You either tell them or you don't. What I've protected has never been information. It's interpretation. The way I experience the world isn't something I hand to people casually. Not because I'm afraid they'll reject it, because I'm aware of how easily people replace what is with what they're comfortable believing. They don't mean to, it's simply how perception works. People don't always see you. They see the version of you their mind knows how to hold. And eventually, they start speaking to that version instead of the real one. I've watched it happen too many times. Not with anger, not even with disappointment, just with quiet acceptance. Because expecting everyone to understand you is another form of misunderstanding. So I adapted. I became careful, not guarded, careful. There's a difference between closing a door and learning which doors don't need to be opened. Most people never realized there were rooms they hadn't entered. They assumed what they saw was everything. I let them believe that it made life easier, simpler, predictable, until something shifted. Not because you demanded honesty, not because you earned trust through some extraordinary act. Nothing about this followed the usual sequence. You simply existed in a way that made pretending unnecessary. I've spent years thinking clarity comes from explanation. Now I'm beginning to wonder if clarity comes from recognition instead, because I rarely explained anything to you, not completely, not in the way people usually expect. And yet, there were moments when your response landed exactly where my thoughts had already arrived. Not almost. Exactly. Do you know how unsettling that is? To realize someone understood the destination without watching the journey? Most people need every step, every reason, every sentence in the correct order. Otherwise, they lose the meaning somewhere along the way. You didn't. It was as if you saw the entire shape before I finished drawing it. At first, I questioned myself. Maybe I was imagining patterns that weren't there. The mind enjoys creating connections. It finds comfort in coincidence. I told myself that's all this was. A fortunate series of misunderstandings that somehow felt meaningful. But Coincidence has limits. It doesn't sustain itself indefinitely. Eventually, randomness reveals its inconsistency. This never did. The more I paid attention, the more accurate everything became. Not perfect. Accuracy doesn't require perfection. It requires consistency. And your understanding was consistent in a way I couldn't dismiss. Not because you agreed with me. Agreement has never impressed me. Anyone can agree. Real understanding exists even when agreement disappears. You could see the shape of what I meant before deciding whether you shared it. That's rare. Rare enough that I almost refused to believe it, because believing it meant admitting something I wasn't prepared to face. Maybe I wasn't as alone inside my own mind as I'd always assumed. That's a strange thing to realize. People often talk about loneliness as if it's measured by the number of people around you. I've never believed that. Loneliness isn't physical, it's structural. It's the distance between your inner world and everyone else's ability to reach it. You can be surrounded by voices and still exist entirely by yourself. I've lived there for a long time. Long enough that solitude stopped feeling lonely. It simply became familiar. Familiar enough that I stopped expecting anything different. Then you arrived. And nothing obvious changed. My routines stayed the same. My habits stayed the same. My life looked identical from the outside. But internally, something subtle began rearranging itself. I didn't notice it immediately. Tonal changes rarely announce themselves. They're discovered backwards. You recognize them only after realizing you no longer think the way you used to. That's what happened. One day I caught myself anticipating how you'd perceive something. Not because I needed validation, because your perspective had become part of the landscape inside my own thinking. That shouldn't happen, at least not to me. I've always processed everything alone, not out of pride, not because I believed I didn't need people, because I've never found anyone whose way of seeing the world felt compatible enough to exist alongside mine without distorting it. Every influence changes you. The question is whether it changes you into someone more accurate or someone more acceptable. I've always chosen accuracy, even when it isolated me, especially then. So I learned to build an internal world that didn't depend on external confirmation. It was stable, reliable, self-sufficient, or at least I thought it was. Now I'm starting to wonder whether stability was simply another word for incompleteness, because complete systems don't reject compatible pieces. They integrate them. Maybe that's why this feels less like disruption and more like recognition, as if something unfinished quietly noticed the part that had always belonged with it. I'm careful with thoughts like these, not because they're emotional, because they're powerful. Ideas shape reality long before actions ever do. The moment you believe something belongs inside your life, your entire perception reorganizes around that belief. I've seen it happen. I've watched people convince themselves they found certainty when all they found was hope wearing certainty's clothes. I promised myself I'd never confuse the two. Hope imagines, certainty observes. I've tried to remain an observer, every feeling examined, every conclusion questioned, every assumption tested, until only what could survive remained. That's how I've always lived. So naturally, A/B tested this too. I created distance, not physically, mentally. I stepped back from every conclusion that seemed too easy. I searched for flaws in my own perception. I looked for evidence that I was projecting meaning where none existed. I wanted to prove myself wrong. It would have been easier, safer. cleaner. But every attempt produced the same result. The distance changed nothing. The silence changed nothing. Time changed nothing. If anything, everything, everything became clearer, not louder. Clarity rarely raises its voice. It simply removes everything that isn't true until what's left can no longer be mistaken for anything else. That's where I find myself now, standing in front of something that hasn't demanded belief, hasn't asked for trust, hasn't even requested acknowledgement. It has simply remained unchanged, steady, present, as if it never needed my permission to exist in the first place. And maybe that's what unsettles me most. Not that you've become important, importance can be explained. Not that you've become familiar, familiarity can be understood. It's something quieter than both of those. Something I still don't have language for, because every word I reach for feels slightly too small. Conscience, recognition, dalliance, understanding, they're all close. None of them are exact. It's as though whatever this is exists just beyond language, waiting patiently while words struggle to catch up. Maybe that's why silence has become so significant. Silence doesn't reduce things. It doesn't translate them into something manageable. It simply allows them to remain exactly as they are. And somehow, whenever everything becomes quiet, you don't feel the absence of conversation anymore. I feel the presence of something that no longer depends on it. There was a time when I believed that understanding always came after explanation, that if two people ever reached the same conclusion, it was because they had carefully walked each other through every thought that led there, every hesitation, every contradiction, every invisible turn the mind takes before it finally settles on something true. Now I'm not so sure, because somewhere along the way, I started noticing something that didn't fit that belief. There were moments when I would arrive at a realization, and before I had even found the language to hold it, somehow, it already existed between us, not spoken, not confirmed, simply there, like discovering footprints in a place you were certain no one else had ever been. That shouldn't have been possible, at least not according to everything I thought I understood about people. We're taught that closeness is built through time, that recognition grows slowly, that trust is earned one experience at a time until eventually two lives become familiar enough to stop feeling separate. But nothing about this followed that sequence. It didn't rush. It didn't skip steps. It simply ignored the idea that those steps were necessary. And I still don't know what to make of that, because I'm someone who notices process. I notice how things happen almost more than I notice that they happened at all. I pay attention to patterns, to causes, to the quiet mechanics underneath every emotion people describe but rarely examine. Most connections reveal themselves if you watch long enough. You can trace them backward, wind the conversation that mattered, the decision that changed everything, the day someone unknowingly crossed a line they could never uncross. I've searched for that moment here, repeatedly, and every time I think I found it, it slips away, because there wasn't one moment, there were hundreds, tiny shifts, almost invisible, each one too small to matter on its own, yet somehow, together, they became something neither of us announced. I think that's how the deepest things happen, not through one extraordinary event, but through ordinary moments refusing to remain ordinary. A pause that lasts 1 second longer than expected. A sentence that carries more weight than it should. The strange comfort of realizing someone understood what you meant before your words caught up with your thoughts. those things accumulate quickly until one day you realize you're standing somewhere entirely different from where you thought you were going. And the strange part is, you don't remember taking the journey. I've replayed conversations in my mind more times than I'd ever admit. Not because I was searching for hidden meaning, because I was searching for mistakes, for evidence that I imagined this, for proof that I misunderstood what felt so undeniably clear. I expected memory to expose the illusion. Instead, memory kept becoming more precise. The details I thought would fade only became sharper. Not because they were dramatic, because they were honest. Honesty has a strange quality. It survives repetition. You can revisit it years later, and somehow it still feels exactly the same. Performance never survives like that. Eventually, performance reveals the effort behind it. The cracks appear, the timing feels rehearsed, the words lose their weight. Nothing here has done that. If anything, the quieter it becomes, the more impossible it is to ignore. Maybe that's why I've stopped asking whether this is real. Reality isn't measured by certainty. It's measured by consistency. And this has remained consistent through every doubt I've thrown at it, every attempt to simplify it, every effort to convince myself that I was assigning significance where there was only coincidence. Coincidence eventually becomes exhausted. Truth doesn't. Truth simply waits until you're willing to stop arguing with it. I'm beginning to think I've spent more energy resisting clarity than seeking it. Not because clarity frightened me, because clarity changes responsibility. Once you know something, you become accountable to it. You can't unknow it. You can't return to the comfort of uncertainty. Ignorance disappears. The moment recognition arrives, that's the cost of seeing clearly. You inherit decisions you weren't prepared to make. And I've always preferred observation over decision. Observation asks nothing of you. You simply notice, you learn, you understand. Decision is different. Decision rearranges reality. It separates every future that could have existed from the one you actually choose. That's why I've always been patient, not hesitant, patient. People confuse those two all the time. Hesitation comes from fear, patience comes from respect. Respect for consequences, respect for timing, respect for the understandings that some things become clearer if you refuse to force them into definition too early. I've lived that way for as long as I can remember. I've never needed immediate answers, only accurate ones. But accuracy has led me somewhere unexpected. It has led me here, to a truth that doesn't become less true simply because I refuse to name it. There's something strange about how naturally you've become part of my internal landscape, not my routine, not my schedule. Those things are temporary. I'm talking about something much deeper. The invisible place where perspective forms before thoughts ever become words. I used to believe that place belonged entirely to me, private, untouched. A space no one could enter because no one even knew it existed. Now, when I examine it carefully, be noticed traces of you everywhere. Not because you've replaced anything, because you've become part of how everything connects. It's subtle enough that I almost miss it, until I catch myself interpreting something through a perspective I didn't possess before. Then I stop, not out of concern, out of fascination. How does someone become present in your thinking without ever demanding space inside it? How does someone influence your perception without trying to persuade you? Influence usually announces itself. People argue, convince, challenge, uplift against your beliefs until something eventually shifts. You never did that. You never tried to move me. And yet, somehow, the landscape still changed. Not because you built something new, because you illuminated parts of what was already there. That's a different kind of change. The kind that doesn't feel like transformation. It feels like recognition, as though something inside me had been waiting, not for completion, but for confirmation. I wonder sometimes if that's what people misunderstand about connection. They think it's about finding someone who changes you. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it's about finding someone who reveals the parts of you that were always waiting to be seen accurately. There's comfort in that thought, but there's also danger. Because once something hidden becomes visible, you become responsible for it. You can't pretend it never existed. You can't return it to the shadows just because visibility feels unfamiliar. Awareness has no reverse. Once it arrives, it stays, quietly, potently, waiting for you to decide what to do with everything it has shown you. I've delayed that decision for longer than I expected, not because I don't know the answer, because I wanted to be absolutely certain that the answer belonged to reality, and not to hope. Hope has misled enough people already. I refuse to let it guide me. But this doesn't feel like hope anymore. Hope reaches forward. This simply exists, steady enough that it no longer asks to be believed, only acknowledged. And perhaps that's the difference I've been trying to understand all along. Some things ask for faith, others become undeniable long before you are willing to admit they've already become part of your life. I think this belongs to the second kind, and maybe, just maybe, that's why every attempt to return to the way things were before feels less like moving backward and more like pretending I never learned something that has already become impossible to forget. I used to think that the strongest walls I ever built were the ones that kept people out. Now I realize they were never built to keep people away. They were built to keep my world unchanged. There's a difference. Keeping people out is about fear. Keeping your world unchanged is about preservation. I've always believed that once something enters your inner world, it leaves traces behind, not always visible ones. Sometimes the traces are so subtle you don't notice them until months later, when a thought appears that isn't entirely yours anymore, when your perspective bends in a direction it never would have before, when a silence feels different for reasons you can't explain. That's why I've always been careful, not suspicious. Carefulness has nothing to do with expecting the worst from people. It's about understanding that influence is rarely loud enough to recognize while it's happening. The deepest influences never introduce themselves. They simply become part of the background until one day you mistake them for your own voice. I promised myself long ago that I would never allow that to happen unknowingly. If something was going to change me, A, B wanted to witness every step. I wanted to understand every reason. I wanted to know exactly when the shift began. But life doesn't always respect the systems we create to make sense of it. Some things refuse to leave footprints. They arrive so naturally that by the time you notice them, they've already become part of the foundation. That's what happened here. I don't remember the exact day you became familiar. I don't remember the conversation that made your presence feel expected instead of new. I don't remember deciding that your perspective mattered, because none of those things happened as decisions. They happened as recognition, almost as if my mind accepted something long before I consciously examined it. That unsettles me more than I'd like to admit, not because acceptance is frightening, because unconscious certainty is. I've always trusted conclusions that survived careful analysis. I've never trusted conclusions that appeared before the analysis even began. Yet here I am, holding something my logic didn't create, but somehow keeps confirming. I've questioned it from every direction I know. I've looked for inconsistencies. I've searched for emotional exaggeration. I've tried reducing everything to coincidence, familiarity, projection, even habit. Every explanation eventually collapsed under its own weight. None of them accounted for the one thing that refused to change: decuracy. That's the word I keep returning to. Not affection, not attachment, decuracy. Because every time I step back and observe this honestly, it becomes more precise instead of less. Most illusions become weaker when examined closely. Reality becomes sharper. And this this only sharpens. I've started wondering if people misunderstand certainty altogether. They imagine certainty as confidence, as certainty sounding loud, Dobbeslutz, unshakable. But real certainty doesn't feel like that. It feels quiet, almost ordinary, like reaching the end of a long equation and realizing the answer was present long before you finish solving it. There's no excitement, no dramatic revelation, just a calm recognition that nothing else fits as cleanly. That's what this has become. Not exciting, not overwhelming. Simply accurate. I've noticed another change too. One that took longer to recognize because it wasn't about you, it was about me, or maybe about the version of me that existed before this. I used to spend so much energy maintaining distance inside my own thoughts, examining every reaction before accepting it, questioning every instinct before trusting it, treating certainty almost like something dangerous. Now, the questioning hasn't disappeared, but it has changed. I'm no longer questioning whether this exists. I'm questioning what its existence asks of me. Those are completely different questions. One searches for evidence, the other searches for direction. And direction has always been more difficult. Evidence is objective. You collect it, you compare it, you reach a conclusion. Direction requires something evidence never provides: choice. Choice has always fascinated me. People speak about choice as if it happens in a single moment. I don't think it does. I think decisions begin long before we recognize them. They grow quietly beneath awareness, invisible potter potter, until eventually they reach a point where saying them out loud feels less like choosing and more like admitting what has already been true. Maybe that's why some confessions feel inevitable, not because they're emotional, because they've already existed internally for so long that silence stops feeling honest. I'm beginning to understand that silence has limits, not because silence becomes uncomfortable, because eventually it becomes incomplete. There's only so long something true can exist without language before language starts becoming necessary, not to prove it, to honor it. I've spent a long time believing words were optional, that understanding mattered more than expression. Perhaps I still believe that, but understanding without expression eventually becomes its own kind of distance. And distance has never been the goal. Protection was. There's another realization I've been avoiding, not intentionally. Some truths simply wait until you're capable of carrying them. This is one of those truths. I've always thought compatibility was about similarities, shared interests, shared experiences, shared ways of living. Those things matter, but they're not what lasts. What's lasting is something much quieter. It's the way two minds respond to uncertainty, the way they hold silence, the way they approach complexity without needing immediate conclusions. That's where I recognize you. Not in what you've lived, not in what you've done, but in the shape of your attention. People reveal themselves through what they notice, far more than through what they say. Anyone can choose their words. Few people choose what naturally captures their awareness. That's instinct. And instinct tells the truth long before language catches up. I've watched yours carefully, not to judge it, to understand it, because understanding someone's attention is understanding the direction of their inner world, where they naturally return, what they refuse to. Your presence stopped being something outside my life and became part of the way I experience life itself. Maybe that's the answer I spent all this time searching for. Not what this is, not where it's going, not what name the world would give it. The answer is much simpler than that. Some people pass through your life and leave memories. Some leave questions, some leave echoes that disappear with time. But once, in a very rare while, someone leaves you seeing the world with different eyes. And no matter where life carries the two of you after that, you never become the person you were before they existed, because the deepest connections aren't remembered. They're lived, quietly, continuously, until one day you realize they were never standing beside your journey at all. They had become part of the way you walk it.